It's good to see everybody here this morning. We do have visitors with us, and we thank you for being here and hope that you'll feel welcome and come back any and every opportunity you have. As you can see on the screen, I'm going to talk about the subject of child abuse. And it may not be the kind of child abuse that we're normally accustomed to thinking about, but it is different forms of that. And it's very important because we're claiming that we are followers of Jesus Christ and that we value His blood that was shed for us on the cross. And if we truly do, that gospel calls upon us to be holy and to practice what is right and to be servants of Jesus Christ and to serve righteousness. And one thing that you cannot do and be under the blood of Jesus Christ and recipients of His blood is to be a person who abuses children. And I'm not talking just physically, but that's more obvious to us, I think. That if we're abusers of children, and I can think of nothing that angers me more than to see pictures of children whose faces have been bruised and damaged because of adults who did not value their children enough to behave properly toward them. That angers me. A righteous indignation stirs within every Christian's heart who is thinking when you see something of that sort, children abused by parents. Jesus took the little children into His arms in Matthew chapter 18. And His disciples thought they were in the way, but Jesus didn't. Jesus took them into His arms and He blessed them. And He said, "Suffer the little children to come unto me, for such is the kingdom of heaven." The kingdom of heaven values little innocent souls. And any thinking parent would feel the same way. Every year, about 2,000 children in this country die as a result of child abuse. Thousands of other children are injured seriously, emotionally, if not in body and emotions, by abusive parents. There are many parents who are not guilty of physical abuse, but may be guilty of emotional abuse. And then there's something even worse than physical abuse and emotional abuse, and that is spiritual abuse. Let's let that sink in. I am making the affirmation that I believe that the Bible teaches, and that is that the soul of a child is more important than, yes, even their bodies. Our own soul is more important than us sustaining our own bodies. Therefore, that translates over to the children as well. So I want to talk about different forms of child abuse, and I'd like us to think very, very seriously about it in these particular ways, so that we will either not be guilty of it, or if some way guilty, we will improve and do better. Well, the first thing I'd like us to think about as a form of child abuse is trying to raise up children with no discipline. That as we become too caught up into the thinking of the world about us, that we think that that we're doing them favors by not doing anything to restrain them or to discipline them. And let me point out, there are two things about discipline. Sometimes we think that there's only one thing about discipline, but there are two major areas of discipline. Sometimes we think that discipline is only spanking the children when they do bad. That is a form of discipline, but that's not the whole of discipline. When the Lord says to discipline our children and expects us so, and that God himself disciplines his children, Hebrews chapter 12. And he is not saying that the totality of discipline is the corporal form of discipline. And it's only in a negative response to a negative action. But part of the discipline that the Lord expects is also positive discipline. In other words, when they do something right, when they do something good around the house, are we quick to praise them for that? To give them that kind of encouragement? That's discipline as well. You see, when you only do one and not the other, you're not disciplining them in the proper way. So we're going to talk about both of those forms in this lesson, but I'd like us to think seriously about it, that if we do not apply proper discipline, that leaves their souls in danger. And that is a form of spiritual abuse, which is worse than physical abuse. Colossians 3, verse 21 says, "Fathers, do not provoke your children, lest they become discouraged." In other words, you're not to let them become discouraged. And you can do that by not praising them when they do something good. So it's very important. Those little sensitive souls are looking up to parents. And they want to know, do you accept me? And am I doing something that pleases you? And when they are, it won't hurt to hug them and to say, "I sure appreciate you doing that. That is so sweet. That is so good of you." And to give them that kind of encouragement instead of discouraging them. If all that they hear out of parents is negative, if you grow up thinking only that mom or dad, that they're just going to punish me when they get home, or that's the way they visualize. They visualize that the parent. Sometimes the mom may get tired of disciplining the child and say, "When your daddy gets home, you're going to get it." And the daddy begins to form this image that's all he's about, is he's the punisher. And so what I'm saying in that is that they need to be known. You need to be known from not only your firmness, your firm side of love, but they also need to know the soft side of your love. That is, that you really do value them. And they know it. So that when you do have to apply the stronger measures, the corporal kinds of punishment, that they know that you did it because you loved them, not because you hated them. You see, they've got to get that in mind. They've got to sort it out. And the only way that they can sort it out is for you to not only tell them, but to show them. So let's think of that if we do not discipline them in the praise that for doing good, by encouraging them in that, then we become abusers of their tender conscience that's in development. And their conscience is in development as long as they're under your roof and as long as they are under your care, depending on you. Then they are looking to you to discipline them and to encourage them in right and to discourage them from doing what's wrong. And we can provoke them to discouragement totally if we're not very careful. Then Proverbs 13 is a book of wisdom literature. It tells you wise things when you've got choices in front of you. And when we have children, we have choices in front of us as to which route we want to take and which route that we want them to go. And do we want them to be saved? And do we want them to go to heaven? And any caring Christian is going to say yes to those things. I want, more than anything, I want my children to go to heaven. I could not bear the thought that a child does not have every opportunity, and that we did not give them every opportunity in the world to be saved. Proverbs 13:24 says, "He who spares his rod hates his son." I don't know if you listen to Dr. Field or some of those, quote, experts, and I think they are experts in a lot of areas, but I think they miss it on this one. They say that the rod is only the force of words, that words are the rod. Now, that is a rod, for example, the rod of the Lord's mouth. That's his rod, and he uses words that discipline us. And that is a form. But as we'll see in just a moment, that's not the only use of the rod. That's not the only meaning for the word rod. But if you do not use the rod, then it says you don't really love that child. That he hates his son. And he who loves him disciplines him promptly. Because you do love him. You see that if you don't do it, then they'll go in this direction more and more into trouble and into immorality and violence and gang mentality and those kind of things. If you don't discipline them, then they will drift into those friendships that will carry them further and further away. And so you've got to put something inside them where they can manage their own decisions as they grow and grow. They're making wiser choices. And the discipline of the rod is one valid way that the Bible shows that wise people can train and discipline their children. Now, that's not an abusive thing. I know a lot of people will say, well, what you're doing is you're teaching them to hit. Well, what form of discipline do you talk about? Well, you can put them in the corner. Well, that's a form of imprisonment against their will. Are you teaching them to imprison people against their will? I mean, the argument doesn't really stand when you're saying that it teaches them to hit. What it taught me as I was growing up, it never taught me to hit. It taught me to pay attention. It taught me to wake up. It taught me to take seriously the things that the Lord told me to take, or that my parents told me to take seriously. But it never taught me to hit other people. It taught me not to. You see, you can twist the form and you can abuse the form. Yes, you can hit in a way that is not disciplined, but is abusive. But not all striking with the rod is abuse. And don't let anybody tell you differently, because this is the wisdom that comes down from above. It doesn't come from human wisdom alone. It comes from the Lord's word. Another passage along this line, chasten your son while there is hope. There is hope if you'll chasten them, but if you let them go, and their only influence is what their wisdom tells them, and you do not give them any reason to stop going in that direction, then what happens is you have set your heart on them going the wrong direction. And you've set their heart on destruction. Proverbs 22:15. Foolishness is bound up in the heart of a child, but the rod of correction will drive it far from him. Another passage, though, in Proverbs I didn't put up here, but I'd like you to turn to it and look at this very carefully. Proverbs 23, verse 13. Do not withhold correction from a child. Proverbs 23, 13. Do not withhold correction. You withhold correction, that's a form of spiritual abuse. For if you beat him, see, it's not just words. The rod is not just words of your mouth, but it's something you use. If you beat him with the rod, he will not die. It's not going to kill him. You shall beat him with the rod and deliver his soul from hell. You don't do it, you may be sending him to hell. You see, these passages are neglected by the world, and in fact, they're frowned upon by the world. But those who are exercising their thoughts in regard to what does God say about it, then this is wisdom. This is wisdom from above. And I take God over Dr. Phil any day. Now, another thing, though, chapter 29, verse 15. 29, verse 15. Says, the rod and reproof give wisdom. Here are two things. Here's the reproof that comes from our words. And then there's the rod too. Sometimes you can get by with just one. You can get by with just reproof. And sometimes you need both. You need the rod and reproof. I much prefer just the words. Sometimes that's enough, depending on the child. I know with our daughter, it was very seldom, if ever. I don't really remember ever having to strike her. Maybe a little swat. That was enough, because all you had to do is look at her and she'd just melt. And, that was all that she needed. But with my son, it was totally different. So each child is different. It wasn't enough to just use words. You had to get his attention. And that was the other way. Now, not to abuse, not leaving welts, not leaving bruises, not bloodying them anyway, but striking them with such firmness that it caught his attention. You see, there are different forms, rod and reproof in some cases, just reproof in other cases, and sometimes you got to use both. And so let's be careful that we do not abuse them, because the Proverbs writer says if you do not discipline them, that is preparing them for hell. And preparing them for hell is the worst form of child abuse I can think of. Another thing, though, there's more to it, as I said just a moment ago, than just the discipline itself. But there's got to be some training, some spiritual training that the children get from us. And immediately comes to mind Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 5 through 9, where the writer says, and this is Moses, he says, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart. Now get that firmly in your mind that God is first. And I love him with all of my heart, with all of my soul, and with all of my strength. Now, based upon that love for God, the next verse says, and these words which I command you today shall be in your heart. What words? Loving God with all of my heart, with all of my soul, and with all of my strength. I want to have that in my heart. And then you will teach them diligently to your children, and shall talk of them. Talk of what? these principles from God. You'll talk to them about it when you sit in your house. Take time to talk about it in your house. When you walk by the way, this is a great time when you're walking by the way and you're seeing the nature as it is, and God made that. Tell them that. Keep reminding them God made that. God made the trees. God made the birds. And you keep training them and letting them notice that these things did not happen by accident. These things are here because God put them here, and He put them here for you because He loves you. You'll teach them diligently. This will be a priority. And when you lie down, you need to have spiritual books. Not just, the Three Bears, not just Goldilocks, and not just, Cinderella and those kind of things, which are fine. But they need some that teach them about God. And there are lots of material along that line to teach them. Ms. Lee had a book out, and I think we still have it, that teaches little Bible stories to them. You can prepare them for Bible class. Those are things that you can do while you're with them in the house that will reinforce in their own, to develop their own little faith and their own set of principles that you're helping to produce in them. You shall bind them as a sign on your hand. That led the way to what is known later on as phylacteries. Phylacteries was a little box they'd wear on their wrist or their upper arm, or sometimes they would strap this little box, and it had little scriptures in that box. You might have seen pictures of Jews in the past who strapped a little box. And what they were doing was saying, this is a way that I'm trying to remind myself of God's law. Now, I'm not recommending and saying that's the way to do it. I'm just saying that that's a way that some have done it. Now, what he's saying here is you shall bind them as a sign on your hand. That whatever you're going to do with your hands, you're going to do it because God is going to be glorified. Or, I'm not going to do this because I believe that it will reflect bad on our God. You'll bind them as frontlets between your eyes so that you're always focused on that. And you shall write them on the doorposts of your house and on your gates when you're leaving the house. You leave with God. When you come back to the house, you're coming back with God. You're not leaving God out of any area of your life, is the point. And the children know that when you leave, you're going with God. And when you come home, you're coming home with God. And when they're there, they're then getting the message that we work and we do what we do because God wants us to do these things. And this is a part of doing the will of God. Proverbs 22 verse 6 says, train up a child in the way he should go. And when he is old, he will not depart from it. In the way that he should go is a loving way. In the way that he should go is a way that brings great satisfaction and joy to his heart. And then when he experiences something outside, he recognizes we're missing something out here. I need to come back to God. Those are things that we can do while we've got those tender, impressionable hearts under our care. Let me point out another one. And this is quickly. Provoking them to extreme anger by making unreasonable demands. Making demands is one thing. Making them frustrated by demands that they cannot possibly keep is provoking them to wrath, provoking them to anger. Another thing is being unduly severe in punishing them. That provokes them to anger. Outbursts of anger toward them. When we use the rod in anger, we haven't controlled our own anger yet, and then we are using that as an outlet for our anger. That's not good. And so that may, in consequence, provoke them to anger themselves. And constant criticism, as we pointed out, and little praise, breaking promises to them that they expected us to keep because our word should be our bond. And we're trying to teach them that, and then we break it. And failing to restrain them from a temper tantrum. When they're having a temper tantrum and you just let them have it, let's do nothing about it and do nothing to correct that kind of behavior and that kind of attitude. Sometimes that rod, again, is a good attitude adjuster. It used to be called, put it on that rod, here's an attitude adjustment stick. And this is what it is used for. Now, another form is just harmful exposure. If you know that in your neighborhood there is a gas leak and it may ignite and it may blow up in your yard. If you don't report it, then you are exposing yourself and your family to harm. Well, there are ways that we can expose children to harm. Alcohol in our home exposes them to something we don't want them to dabble with. Well, why are you dabbling with it? It's much more effective for a parent to say, you don't do this, and I'm not going to do it either, than to say, well, it's okay for me, but it's not okay for you. They will see that hypocrisy and harmful exposure to something you say that you don't want them to do. Well, why are you doing it? So harmful exposure puts an opportunity or puts a temptation into their hands. Cigarettes. It would have been much more effective if my parents at that time, when they were raising me, if they hadn't smoked, and they were smokers. They told us not to smoke. Well, that wasn't nearly as effective as if they had not left cigarettes around, and if they didn't smoke to start with. Now later on they broke it, and they did better about that. But what I'm saying is, you can't be doing something that you don't want them to do, and just tell them this is your rule, but mine is this. And they see that as inconsistent. And so that's harmful exposure. The internet, unsupervised internet, is a form of harmful exposure. Unsupervised iPhones and telephones, unsupervised TV and movies. You're letting pollution come in free. And you say, we're going to buy it. And we're going to let our children be exposed to these things. Providing bad examples before them. Saying, you can't watch this, but we're going to watch it. Those things don't speak well of our priorities for our own holiness, much less to try to lead them to the holiness that the Lord expects. And so in conclusion, let me say this. Physical abuse should never be something that we're as Christians are guilty of. Never. But physical abuse is only one form of abuse. Abuse can come in the form of neglect. That is, you can neglect so great salvation that the Lord has provided to you. You neglect it, what you're telling your children is you can neglect it too. It's all right for daddy to neglect it. It's all right for the children to neglect it. It's all right for mama. Then it's all right for me. How will we escape if we neglect so great salvation, which at the first began to be spoken by the Lord and then was confirmed to us by those who heard him? Neglect is a form of abuse. We must expose our children to the way that will lead to their salvation. The most important thing, if we don't have the best place to live, if we don't have the best cars to drive, children are not going to get to the judgment seat and say, Dad, why didn't you get me a better car than that? But wouldn't it be bad? Wouldn't it be haunting for them to get to the judgment seat and they say, Dad, why didn't you tell me about Jesus? Why didn't you tell me the way to go to heaven? Those words will haunt us for all eternity if we neglect their salvation. I hope this morning that gives us a lot of thought about our responsibility, because we are trying to serve Jesus Christ. He says, these souls that you have in your hands, these souls I want you to bring back to me in heaven. This little precious baby, that's a soul. And I want you to bring that baby back to heaven. That's your responsibility as parents and as grandparents. We can all play a part in saving the souls of our children. And if you're here this morning, you've never obeyed the gospel, you want to set the right example, and we can help you in your obedience to the gospel of Christ. Please come now as we stand together and sing this song.